All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all so much for being here. If you're new here, welcome to our fourth and final session in the Wired for Wonder Summer Series on ADHD. Today's session is ADHD in adults, and if you have been to my other sessions, welcome back. So whether you have ADHD yourself, or you were diagnosed as a child, or diagnosed later in life, or even just think you might have ADHD, or maybe you're even just here because you want to support someone that you love who does. I'm really glad that you're here. So throughout the series, we spent a lot of time talking about ADHD in children, but thanks to new research, we now know that ADHD doesn't disappear when we become adults. Instead, life gets more complicated. We have careers, families, bills, relationships, laundry, appointments, and about 1,000 other responsibilities competing for our attention every day. So before we jump in tonight, I want to say something a little different. So if you've been to one of my other sessions, you might notice that this one has a different feel. So tonight is not about diving into the nitty-gritty of neuroscience, and we aren't going to spend a lot of time talking about brain anatomy, neurotransmitters, or every executive functioning strategy like we have in previous sessions. We've done a lot of that together already. So if you did miss all of that, head on over to the Blacksburg Library YouTube channel and catch up. But if this is your very first session, don't worry, you'll still leave with some practical tools that you can use right away. But tonight is different. So tonight is about understanding what it means to live with an ADHD brain. It's about recognizing that so many of the struggles you've carried for years are not character flaws. It's about learning how to support yourself with the same kindness and understanding that you would offer someone that you love. Because here's what I've learned. Knowledge is powerful, but knowledge without compassion often just becomes another way to criticize ourselves. And my hope is that tonight you don't just leave with new information. I hope you leave seeing yourself a little bit differently. And tonight is about taking everything that we've learned up to this point and asking one question. What does all of that actually mean for my life as an adult with ADHD? So tonight we're going to understand our ADHD experience and learn how to support our brains, and end by celebrating who we are. So before we jump in, I want to let you know where we're headed tonight. So first, we are going to understand your ADHD experience. We're going to talk about why adulthood can feel so different with ADHD, and why so many of the struggles that people experience aren't character flaws. They're rooted in how the ADHD brain works. Then we're going to move into supporting your brain. So we'll look at some practical research-based ways to work with your brain instead of constantly fighting against it. And finally, we're going to celebrate who you are, because ADHD isn't your entire identity. It's one part of your story. And we'll end by reflecting on your strengths, your growth, and moments that remind you of the very best version of yourself. My goal tonight is not for you to leave with an even longer to-do list. My goal is for you to leave with more understanding, more self-compassion, and more confidence. And maybe one small thing I want you to try. So before we talk about ADHD, I want to start with something that I think is really important. And that is that no two ADHD journeys are the same. So some of you, like me, were diagnosed as children, or some weren't diagnosed until adulthood. Or some of you started asking questions because you started researching about your own child and you started thinking, wow, that sounds a lot like me. And then suddenly everything in your own life started making a little bit more sense. Some of you have noticed symptoms changing over time. Maybe hormones, stress, increased responsibilities have made ADHD feel different than it used to. And some of you are still trying to figure out whether or not ADHD even fits your story. And some of you are here because you love someone with ADHD and you want to understand them better. And every one of those journeys is valid. And no matter how you got here, we all came here for the same reason, and that's to understand ourselves and the people that we love. So as we go through tonight, I don't want you to compare your story to anyone else's. I don't want you to compare your story to mine. I want you to better understand yourself and understand that ADHD doesn't look exactly the same in every person, and that's okay. So your journey is your own and it deserves understanding. So with that in mind, let's talk about what adulthood with ADHD can sometimes feel like. So imagine just for a moment that every responsibility you carry in life is placed into a backpack. Your job, your family, your bills, the laundry, your appointments, your relationship, remembering birthdays, getting dinner on the table, making doctor's appointments, keeping the house running. For most adults, even without ADHD, that backpack is already pretty heavy. So now imagine trying to carry that same backpack with an ADHD brain. It's not that you're carrying more than everyone else. It's that the way your brain manages that load is different. And some days it feels like the zipper is open. You've got crumbs pouring out everywhere. There's stuff wadded up in the bottom. Things are falling out. And that is how my backpack looks at all times. And no matter how hard you try, you can't seem to keep everything together. And after a while, you start wondering, why does this seem so much harder for me than it does for everyone else? And that's the question that adults with ADHD ask themselves. But I want to challenge that question because I don't think it's the right question that we should be asking. So let's look at what we should be asking instead. So again, people with ADHD, adults, spend years asking things like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just get it together? Why does everyone else seem to be able to do this except for me? And those questions usually lead to guilt and shame and self-blame, but they don't lead to understanding. So instead, I'd encourage you to ask a different question. Not what's wrong with me, but what's getting in my way? And like we've talked about before, that small shift in mindset really can make a huge difference. Because when we stop blaming ourselves and start getting curious, we can actually begin to solve a problem. And it goes back to what we've said in previous sessions about thinking like a detective instead of like a firefighter. You know, maybe it is an executive functioning challenge. Maybe it's sleep, maybe it's stress, maybe it's hormones, maybe it's your environment. Curiosity opens the door to solutions. And tonight, I hope you leave asking yourself fewer judgmental questions and a lot more curious ones. Because you're not a problem to fix, you're a person to understand. And if there's one thing that I hope you take away from this tonight, is please don't leave here thinking that you have to change everything. And one of the biggest traps we fall into as adults is thinking we need to try and overhaul our entire lives all at once. You know, we get excited, we buy the planner, we download the apps, we get the bins, we make the schedule. And we tell ourselves, starting tomorrow, I'm going to wake up early, I'm going to exercise, I'm going to meal prep, I'm going to drink more water, I'm going to keep the house clean, I'm never going to procrastinate again. And then, you know, about 2 days later, you know, it's out the window, right? You're exhausted, you're burnt out, because real change doesn't happen that way. It's not sustainable, it's not practical. Instead, I want you to choose one thing, one small experiment, one strategy, one habit, one support. And when you came in tonight, you received a journal. And I want you to keep that nearby as we go through the presentation. And as something stands out to you or something makes you think, that might actually help me, write it down. Not everything, just one or two things that really resonate with you. And by the end of tonight, I don't want a journal filled with this overwhelming to-do list of, you know, well, Samantha gave me all these things that I need to do and I've got to do them all at once and do all this research. I just want you to hold on to one experiment that you're willing to try this week. Because small, consistent changes are much more powerful than trying to change your entire life overnight. So as we go through tonight, again, don't feel like you have to remember every single thing. Just keep asking yourself, what is one thing that might make my backpack just a little bit lighter? All right, so I want you to imagine two people setting out on the same journey. One person is walking on this smooth paved road, and the other is walking on that winding dirt road, probably the dirt road to neuroscience. And both are headed towards the same direction, as you can see, in the same destination. Neither road is wrong, but both of them are different. And that's what living with ADHD can feel like. For years, many adults with ADHD compare themselves to people who seem to move through life effortlessly. And they think, why can't I just do what everyone else does? But here's something I'd encourage you to think about. Maybe their road was smoother and maybe they got there faster, but what did they miss along the way? Sometimes it's the dirt roads that lead to the most beautiful views. It's the hidden waterfalls, the wildflowers, the unexpected adventures, the people you never would have met, the resilience that you never would have built, and the creativity that you never would have discovered. And I truly believe that many people with ADHD develop incredible empathy, creativity, humor, perseverance, and problem-solving skills because they've had to navigate a different road. And would most of us choose the challenges that come along with ADHD? Well, probably not. But that doesn't mean our journey has no value. It has shaped us, it has taught us, and it's helped us become who we are. So instead of asking, why isn't my road paved? Ask, what has this road taught me that someone else's never could? Because different doesn't mean less. And sometimes different lets you see things that people on the highway drive right past. And just like any road, there are days when the trail is smooth, and there are days when it feels like you're climbing uphill. Have you ever noticed that some days you feel like you've got this, you're focused, you're on it, you're productive, you remember all the things, you're checking things off your list, and then the very next day, doing one simple task feels impossible? The same person, the same brain, just a different day. That doesn't mean you're lazy. It doesn't mean you've suddenly lost all of your motivation. Some days, the road is simply steeper. Things like stress, poor sleep, hormonal changes, a busy week, decision fatigue, an unexpected interruption. All of those things can make the same task require so much more effort than it did yesterday. And one of the biggest lessons that I've learned is to stop judging myself based on my hardest days, because our capacity changes. And that's true for everyone, but especially for people with ADHD brains. So again, instead of asking, why can't I do today what I did yesterday? Maybe ask, what's making this road steeper today? Again, going back, like we've talked in previous sessions about finding that bottleneck, what's causing the traffic jam? Because when you understand what changed, you can respond with support instead of self-criticism. And one of the biggest reasons that the road changes from day to day has to do with something I like to call your executive functioning battery. So I want you to think of your executive functioning battery like the battery on your phone. Some mornings you remember to plug that baby up before you went to bed. You wake up, you're at 100%. Planning feels easier. Getting started feels easier. You're remembering things, you regulate your emotions a little bit better. But then other mornings, you wake up and for reasons completely outside of your control, your battery starts at 40%. Maybe you didn't sleep well. Maybe you're sick. Maybe your hormones are shifting. Maybe you're under a lot of stress. Maybe you've spent weeks masking and you're just simply exhausted. The problem is, life doesn't care where your battery started it at that morning. Your kids still need breakfast. You still have to go to work. The laundry still has to be done. Those emails still have to be answered. And the world hands you a list of tasks that would take 100% battery to accomplish, but you're trying to do it with 40%. And that doesn't mean you're not trying hard enough. It means you're working with less available executive functioning than you had yesterday. And here's the tricky part. It's not always predictable. Tomorrow you might wake up with 90%, the next day 25%. And the goal isn't to judge yourself because today's battery looks different than yesterday's. The goal is to recognize your capacity. So instead of asking, why can't I do everything I did yesterday? Ask, how much battery did I start with today? And what does my brain need? And once you understand your capacity, you can stop expecting your brain to perform like it's fully charged when it started the day half empty. So if our battery starts at different levels from one day to the next, how do we figure out why? Well, that's where we become detectives. So one of the biggest shifts we can make as adults with ADHD is moving from becoming a critic to a detective. Again, detectives don't make assumptions. They gather clues. They get curious. And so the next time you're having a hard day, instead of immediately saying, I'm lazy or I'm failing, I want you to ask yourself, what clues am I missing? Did I get enough sleep? Have I eaten today? An iced coffee all day does not count, ladies, okay? That breakfast that you had. Am I overwhelmed? Have I been sitting here for hours without moving? Is my environment distracting? Is my battery already drained? So for many of us, we've spent years reacting to our struggles instead of investigating them. But once you start looking for these patterns, you begin to understand your brain instead of fighting against it. So maybe every Monday feels harder because your weekends have no routine. I know mine don't. And maybe your focus disappears every afternoon because you only had that iced coffee for breakfast and you skipped lunch. And maybe your medication works differently depending on how much sleep you got the night before. These are not character flaws. These are clues. And the more clues you gather, the better you'll understand what your brain needs to do its very best work. So again, stop asking what's wrong with me and start asking what made today harder. And we move from shame to understanding. And once you understand your brain, like we've said before, you can start supporting it. So let's talk about what that support actually looks like. So we've spent some time understanding the ADHD brain, but I want to shift our focus because understanding is important, but understanding alone doesn't make your life any easier. Support does. So I think a lot of us have spent years, trying to force our brains to work like someone else's does. And we tell ourselves, I just need to try harder. I just need more willpower or to be more disciplined or, to be more motivated. But what if that's the wrong goal? What if instead of trying to force your brain to fit into the world, you start building a world that's better fit for your brain? That's what support is. Support isn't cheating. It isn't weakness. Support is just recognizing what your brain needs to do its very best work. And just like someone who wears glasses, well, it isn't cheating. Would I say it's cheating because you wear glasses to help you see? No, it's, using supports for ADHD isn't taking the easy way out. It's giving your brain what it needs to function. So over the next few slides, we're going to look at some of the biggest factors that can either drain your battery or help recharge it. None of these things will cure your ADHD. I'm sorry. When I figure out that one, I will make a lot more money than I do currently. But together we can make the road a whole lot easier to walk. So what can we actually do about it? So one of the biggest misconceptions about ADHD is that there's like one magic strategy that's going to work for everyone. I wish more than anything that were the case, but there isn't. So ADHD management isn't about finding the tool. It's about building your toolbox. And if you've been to my other sessions, we talk about this a lot. Everybody's toolbox looks different. Not everybody needs every single tool, but by creating a toolbox, you have access to these supports when you need them. And so we've also talked about how we can use these supports with kids. And many of these same strategies that we use to support children, these work just as well in adults with ADHD. The only difference is that now you're the one building the supports. So if your brain struggles to remember things, stop asking it to remember more. Get it out of your head. We've talked about working memory in that executive function. You have to offload your working memory. My working memory only might have that tiny Post-it note worth of space to hold information, that tiny Dollar Tree Post-it note that doesn't even stick. That's my working memory, which is why you see my 30 pages of notes. So I have to offload my working memory. I have to write it down. If you tell me something and I do not write it down, it will not happen. If I cannot physically see it up on my refrigerator, I have Post-it notes or whiteboards or anything. I have them on my door next to where I leave. I have them on my refrigerator. I have my office calendar in my home office, in my work calendar, my purse calendar, my phone calendar. That's my system. Do I recommend it for everyone? No. But for me, it works because with people with ADHD, if you can't see it, it doesn't exist, right? So I have to see it. So get it out of your head and write it down. Again, just keep one notebook or put that whiteboard on the refrigerator. Your brain is amazing at creating ideas, but it was never designed to be a filing cabinet. So if time seems to disappear, and for many adults with ADHD, it does, make time visible. Set alarms for when to start, not just when something is due. And if I have an assignment or an important deadline, I never actually write the day it's due in my calendar. I write 3 or 4 days before that it's due to give myself a buffer. I have to leave time for a disaster because I know there's going to be one. So why not plan for that disaster? And so this, again, allows me to always be on time, always be efficient. And, if you know you're somebody who forgets appointments a lot, well, don't put that reminder in your phone for 5 minutes before the appointment. Maybe it needs to be the week before and the, 3 days before and the day before and 3 hours before and 30 minutes before, and that's okay. And again, use a visual timer while you're working. We use these things for kids, but as adults, sometimes our brains need the same things. So again, put appointments on the calendar as soon as you make them. Do not leave the doctor's office with that little business card. You're going to throw it in your center console and you're going to lose it and you're never going to see it again. All right. Put it in your phone. And then when you get home, you put it on your calendar that you can see. So I'm going to put it in my phone immediately. I'm going to go in. When I walk in the door, I see my calendar. Immediately, I have to write it there. All right. I know I'm going to lose that card. Who keeps that card? Nobody. Nobody has ever kept up with that card. So stop expecting your brain to. I have the skeletal remains of appointments past, in my console, in between the seats, from 7 years ago. Again, do not rely on an internal clock when you can create an external one. Stop making that little Post-it note hold a notebook's worth of information when you can offload your working memory and have more than one place to support it. So if getting started is one of your biggest challenges, stop waiting until you feel motivated. Motivation often shows up after we've already begun. Instead of clean the kitchen, maybe make the goal walk into the kitchen. Instead of write the report, open the document. Tiny steps create momentum. And it sounds silly, but oftentimes if you can just get started, you'll be fine. But it's the getting started. It's that ADHD paralysis where in your head, you have so many things going on and you're like, I have to clean the house and I have to, get my daughter here and I've got these appointments and I've got, all this work stuff I need to do. And you don't even know where to start. So you do nothing, but instead of saying, I need to clean my entire house, maybe I say, I'm going to focus on one room, or even break that down even smaller. Say, I'm going to do one drawer. I'm just going to do the dresser. I'm just going to do my desk. Stop telling yourself that every single thing needs to be done right now. It doesn't. It's going to be okay, and again, create those tiny steps. Again, we do these same things with kids all the time. We chunk things, we break it down. We talked about a really great app in a previous session called Goblin Tools, where we'll take any task and break it down into smaller steps. As grownups, we need that too. So if emotions feel overwhelming, you don't have to solve every problem the moment that it happens. Regulate your body first. Take a walk, drink some water, call a friend, take a few deep breaths. Once your nervous system settles, your thinking brain can come back online. But when you're irrational, guess what? That part of your brain is quite literally offline. You cannot rationalize what's happening. You don't want to talk to me when I'm mad. All right, come back a couple business days later and I will maybe apologize, okay? But you don't want to talk to me in that moment. But I know that about myself. So I know I might need to, even in my class, when I get overstimulated, my kids are overstimulated, I might need to step outside the door for a minute, take a few deep breaths, collect myself, and then go back in. Because me yelling over top of them, I'm dysregulated, they're dysregulated, guess what's going to happen? No one's going to be regulated, right? So once your nervous system settles and your thinking brain can come back online, then you can move forward and then you can be rational and then you can do what you need to do. You have to manage your emotions. And especially if you've got someone else who is upset, if you're not regulated, they're not going to be regulated. And if both of you are in a room where both of your thinking brains are offline, well, then it's just, like cavemen and nobody's rational. So if organization is your struggle, stop expecting your memory to do the work. Give your keys one home. Give your wallet one home. Keep a catch-all basket by the door. You come home, you dump all your stuff into that basket. It creates a launch pad by the door so you have everything ready the next day on your way out. Is it going to look cute? Probably not, but you're going to know where your stuff is, okay? So stop overthinking it. If you know you always throw your stuff on the counter, well, create a basket on the counter because that's your brain telling you this is where this needs to be. So stop fighting the system. I personally, I have to lay out everything the night before. Not only lay it out, but I put as much stuff in the car already as I can. Like my daughter's backpack, I already have that in the car. If I can pre-make her lunch, I will go ahead and make it and put it in the refrigerator. You know, I'm not fighting with my preteen, you know, at 7 a.m. on what is appropriate to wear to school the next day. We're going to fight it out the night before, you know? So, and I know that's going to happen. So I'm like, let's get this fist fight over with and not wait until we're running late in the morning. Let's do it before bed. So, but again, I know that that's what I have to do to be successful. And I'm always early. I'm always on time. And, you know, but again, I've also had to learn that however long I think it takes for me to do something, I double it. So if I know it normally takes me an hour to do something, I'm going to give myself 2 hours to do that, you know, but I've had to learn what works for me. And if time blindness is something that you really struggle with, record yourself doing something. Record yourself getting ready in the morning, do your normal routine and see how long it actually takes you to do it. Because again, people with ADHD and time blindness, they physically cannot feel time in their bodies. You know, it's not that they're being inconsiderate or thinking the world revolves around them. It's that they physically cannot feel the passing of time. That's like the only ADHD quality I did not get, is I can be on time. But again, I've had to put these systems in place to do that. If I'm just relying on myself to show up, it's not going to be good for anybody. So again, you have to let your environment become your external executive functioning. So do you notice anything here? So none of these tools ask you to become someone else. They simply support the brain that you already have. Again, stop fighting it. Stop saying, well, Pinterest, this is cute, I'm going to do it. No, let's just be real with each other, guys. It ain't going to be cute. We're going to have piles. We're going to have systems. If your husband moves your pile, your life is over, you know? And it's like, he thinks it's a mess, but like, if you put it where it's supposed to go, if it's like, well, where is it? Well, it's in the closet. Well, why would I look there? You know, like I wouldn't put it in the closet, you know, but those systems work for me. And it's not always glamorous, but that's okay because we're human. And you need to allow yourself to be human and to create systems that work for your brain and not for the picture perfect Pinterest brain that we all wish we had. So again, you have to become curious enough to ask, what is my brain struggling with right now? And then choose a tool that matches that challenge. And so that's what I hope you take away tonight, is not that you need to try harder, but you deserve better tools. So speaking of better tools, let's start with one of the most powerful and one of the most overlooked supports for the ADHD brain. Y'all already know what I'm going to say. Big on sleep around here. So I know that sleep isn't exactly a glamorous topic, but if I could convince every single person with ADHD to focus on one single lifestyle change before trying 20 others, sleep would be at the very top of my list. Now, this is the pot calling the kettle black, because ask me how my sleep is. It's trash, okay? But we've learned in previous sessions that, you know, sleep is when our brain does some of its most important work. So when you're asleep, your brain is strengthening memories from the day. That's when it consolidates all your memories, every single thing that you've learned. It clears out metabolic waste products. It's doing that synaptic pruning, basically clipping away the weeds, the unimportant information that your brain took in during the day. It's restoring neurotransmitter systems, and it's resetting the networks that you rely on for attention, learning, emotional regulation, and executive functioning. Sleep plays the biggest role in attention and focus and memory. So guess what, guys? My friends with ADHD here, we're already like bottom of the barrel when it comes to those things. So if you're not sleeping, it's going to make it 10 times worse. Okay. So again, sleep isn't just rest. Sleep is brain maintenance. And when we don't get enough sleep, the very skills that are already challenging for people with ADHD become even harder. So if you've ever had a terrible night's sleep and you don't have ADHD, you probably have experienced what I call temporary ADHD. You can't focus. You lose your train of thought. You walk into the room and forget why you're there. You're more emotional. You're more impulsive. So you're a normal ADHD person, right? But the difference is, you know, for us people with ADHD, many of those struggles are already there. So sleep deprivation is going to turn up that volume. And we've talked about this previously, and something that surprises a lot of people And that up to 60%, and I got the research to back it up to 60% of people with ADHD also have a co-occurring sleep disorder, most of the time that they do not know about. This is kids, this is adults, this could be insomnia. This could be delayed sleep phase, which is where your brain naturally wants to fall asleep much later than everybody else. Restless leg syndrome, sleep apnea. I have sleep apnea. And, or just a brain that refuses to shut off at night because it's still replaying the conversations from 3 days ago, right? So ADHD can make it harder to get a good sleep, and then poor sleep makes ADHD symptoms worse the next day. So it's this vicious cycle. And that's why when someone tells me, well, my medication isn't working well, or my ADHD suddenly feels worse, one of the very first questions I'm going to ask is, how have you been sleeping? Because sometimes what we're seeing isn't that the ADHD has changed, but it's that the brain never got a chance to recharge. And now, does getting 8 hours of perfect sleep cure ADHD? No. But again, think back to that battery analogy. Sleep is one of the biggest ways that we're going to be able to recharge that executive functioning battery. So if your day only, or your battery only starts with 40% that day, everything's going to feel a whole lot harder. And so maybe your one experiment this week isn't to change your entire life. Maybe it's putting your phone down 30 minutes earlier, or creating a bedtime routine. Or, I think a lot of times, especially as parents, when the kids go to bed, that's our only time we have to ourselves, right? So we want to stay up. I want to eat a whole box of Little Debbie's without some nasty little kid fingers in them, I want to rot. I want to watch some mindless show, and I want to doom scroll until 1 a.m. because this is the only time I have to myself. And I get that. But we got to do it. You got to go sleep, guys. And again, sleep is a behavior. And guess what we can do with behaviors? We can change them. So you've just got to train your brain. Because again, when you protect your sleep, you're protecting your attention, you're protecting your memory, your emotional regulation, your learning, all of those things. And then your brain's actually able to do what it was designed to do. So sleep helps recharge the brain, but there's something else that our brains were designed for that many of us don't get enough of, and that is movement. All right, let's talk about movement. So when people hear the word exercise, they immediately picture running 5 miles and going to the gym. I will never, ever be telling y'all how to exercise. I am not the one, guys. I'm not the one. All right. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about physically moving your body. And one of the things I love about neuroscience is that it reminds us that our brains didn't evolve sitting at desks all day. And they did evolve while we were walking and climbing and carrying and interacting with the world. So movement isn't just good for your body. It's actually one of the very best things that you can do for your brain. So when you move, your brain releases chemicals like dopamine and norepinephrine. And those, again, we've talked about, are the very neurotransmitters that are involved in attention, motivation, and executive functioning. It also increases blood flow to the brain and stimulates the release of BDNF, a protein that supports learning and neuroplasticity. So in other words, movement helps put your brain in a better position to do what you're asking it to do. And research is actually consistently showing that regular aerobic exercise can improve attention, working memory, impulse control, mood, and executive functioning in people with ADHD. Now, is exercise necessarily a replacement for medication if that's something you take? For most people, no. Medication is still considered the most effective treatment for core symptoms of ADHD, but exercise is one of the strongest lifestyle supports that we have. Think of it as another tool in your toolbox. And for some people, it's the tool that makes all the other tools work a little bit better. Not me. When I exercise, not a single endorphin is released, not a single hit of dopamine. Mine is broken, all right? And I wish I didn't feel that way. But, again, the best kind of movement isn't the kind that someone else tells you how to do. Maybe it's just taking a hot girl walk after dinner. That's what my daughter calls it, a hot girl walk. Maybe it's dancing in your kitchen. Maybe it's gardening. Maybe it's playing outside with your kids. Or maybe it's 10 minutes between meetings. Sometimes I'll go outside and shoot basketball with kids on the playground for a minute, or do a lap around the track if I'm, need to wake up or just need to move, or I've been, stuck in one place for too long. Again, this isn't about burning calories. This is about feeding your brain. And we always think, well, I don't have time to exercise. I tell myself that every day. But I challenge you to think about that differently. Movement isn't taking time away from your day. It's an investment in the quality of the rest of your day. You don't have to become a marathon runner. You just have to move a little bit more than you did the day before. And if you've ever noticed that your child is calmer after recess, or when you've gone for a walk, your mind feels clear. That's not your imagination. That's neuroscience. So let's talk about something I know can be a big challenge for adults with ADHD, nutrition. Again, I got no business telling you guys how to eat. I eat terribly, okay? But before anyone starts worrying, again, this is not a lecture about eating perfectly. And Lord knows if it was, I would not be the leader of this talk. But there is not one magical ADHD diet. But we do know that our brains function better when they're consistently fueled. And so think about it. What happens when you skip breakfast, or you forget to eat all day, or you realize at 4 o'clock that all you've had was that iced coffee? Your battery crashes. Your patience gets shorter. Your focus gets worse. Your emotional regulation becomes harder. If that sounds familiar, your brain needs steady fuel. And that doesn't mean, again, that every meal has to be this perfectly meal prepped, Pinterest-worthy thing. It's not sustainable. Well, for some of you, maybe it is. For me, in my life, it is not. But again, sometimes support looks like keeping just an easy, healthy, high-protein snack nearby. Maybe it's just drinking a little more water or adding a little bit more fiber. Just trying to keep your blood sugar a little bit more stable throughout the day. Progress over perfection. So if all you do after tonight is start your day with a little bit more protein, or remember to drink a little bit more water, that's okay. It doesn't have to be an entire lifestyle change. Because again, food isn't about being perfect. It's about giving your brain the fuel it needs to do its job. And again, nutrition's not going to cure ADHD, but just like sleep and movement, it can make the road a little bit easier to walk. But for many adults, especially women, there's another piece of the puzzle that very often gets overlooked, and that's hormones. So hormones can have a huge impact on ADHD symptoms. And this is one of the most heavily researched topics currently is women and ADHD and perimenopause and hormone changes. So if that's something you're interested in, there's a lot of really good research out there currently. But many women tell me that they were able to manage their ADHD symptoms fairly well for years, or they were able to mask it so well that they didn't even realize that they had ADHD. And then suddenly things changed. Maybe it was puberty, they were younger. Maybe it was pregnancy or the postpartum period. Maybe it was perimenopause or menopause. And maybe you notice that sometimes during your menstrual cycle, your medication doesn't work as well, your emotions feel bigger, or your focus becomes a lot harder. You're not imagining it. Hormones like estrogen actually influence dopamine. And as we know, dopamine plays a major role in ADHD. So when those hormone levels change, ADHD symptoms change too. And I think this is important because so many women blame themselves. They think, why can't I do what I used to do? Well, the answer isn't that you become less capable or you're just getting old and falling apart. Your brain is working under different biological conditions than it was before. And so understanding those patterns can be incredibly empowering. So maybe your support looks like tracking your symptoms throughout the month. Notice those changes. When do you notice them? Write it down. You have a journal now. Maybe your support looks like, having a conversation with your healthcare provider. Maybe it's simply giving yourself a little more grace on the days when you know that your brain is working a little bit harder. And again, your goal isn't to fight biology, it's to understand it and work with it. And, for some people, medication can be part of that conversation. So again, medication is one of the most researched and effective treatments we have for ADHD, yet it is often one of the most misunderstood. And I think it's important to remember that taking medication for ADHD is not about changing who you are. It's not about making you someone different. It's about helping your brain access the abilities that are already there. So for many people, medication can improve focus, reduce impulsivity, strengthen executive functioning, and make it easier to use strategies that we've been talking about tonight. But, medication is not the whole toolbox. It's one tool. For some people, this is an incredibly helpful tool. For others, it's not the right fit. Some people experience side effects, or they have medical reasons why they can't take it, or they simply choose not to, and that's okay. The decision to use medication is always very personal and should always be made with a qualified healthcare provider. So whether you take medication or not, remember this: medication does not replace healthy habits. Just like we talked about for your kids, it works best alongside things like good sleep and nutrition and movement and supportive environments and self-awareness. It's not about choosing medication or lifestyle supports. For many people, it's both. And if it's not, that's okay too. The goal isn't to rely on just one thing. The goal is to build a toolbox that helps your brain succeed. So, one of the biggest misconceptions about ADHD is that success comes from trying harder. But many times success comes from changing your environment, again, so your brain doesn't have to work so hard. So think about it this way. If I handed you a pair of scissors and asked you to cut down a tree, you probably couldn't do it. That doesn't mean you weren't trying. It just means you didn't have the right tool you needed to be successful. Our environment works the same way. We often expect ourselves to focus in a room full of distractions and to remember things that we didn't write down and to stay organized without a system or, manage time without a clock. And then we blame ourselves when that doesn't work. Well, why don't we ask ourselves, how can I make this environment, or how can I make my environment do some of the remembering for me? Again, putting your keys in the same place every day, using those visual timer. Noise canceling headphones have been a game changer for me. I need it to be completely silent so I can focus. And in my life, it is never silent. I am never silent. And so nothing in my life is quiet. Big game changer for me. Setting those reminders, keeping that basket by the door, creating that launch pad. Again, these aren't crutches, these are supports. And your goal isn't to prove that you can do everything without help or without support. It's okay to ask for help. And also understand that because when the environment changes, the brain doesn't have to work nearly as hard. So even with all of these supports, there's something that I think many adults with ADHD need to hear. And I want to, in this particular section, by talking about something that isn't discussed very often. For some people, receiving an ADHD diagnosis or learning more about their brain brings them relief. But for others, it also brings grief. Grief for the years you spent believing that you were lazy, or grief for the opportunities you wonder if you missed. Grief for the relationships that maybe were affected, or grief for the version of yourself that you spent so many years trying to fit into a world that wasn't built for the way that your brain works. If that's a part of your story, I want you to know that those feelings are completely valid. But I also don't want you to stay there. Because while we can't change the past, we can change the story that we tell ourselves moving forward. You now know something about your brain that you didn't know before. And again, that understanding creates options. It creates compassion. It creates hope. And you don't have to spend the rest of your life asking what if. You get to ask, okay, now what? What now? Because no matter where your journey started, you're here and you're learning and you're growing. And that's something worth celebrating. And speaking of celebrating, I think it's time that we stop talking only about what ADHD makes difficult and start talking about what makes you, you. So we spent a lot of time talking about ADHD and all the negative things that kind of come along with that. We've talked about executive functioning and sleep and movement and medication and hormones and all the different ways we can support our brains throughout this series. But before we leave tonight, I don't want ADHD to be the last thing that you think about, because ADHD is something that you have. It's not who you are. So as part of my ADHD coach training, I've been introduced to an exercise called Magnificent Me Moments, and I really like it. A magnificent me moment is a moment in your life when you felt like the very best version of yourself. Not because life was easy, not because everything was perfect, but because just for a moment, you looked at yourself and thought, I'm really proud of who I am. Maybe it was something you accomplished. Maybe it was a challenge that you overcame. Maybe it was a moment when you realized that you were, where you needed to be. And these moments matter because they remind us of something that we often forget. They remind us that we are so much more than a diagnosis. They remind us of what we are capable of. They reconnect us with our values, our purpose, and the version of ourselves that feels the most authentic. And when life gets hard, and it will, we can come back to those moments and remember who we are. So before I ask you to think about your Magnificent Me moment, I'd like to share mine. So when I think about the best version of myself, I don't think about an award or a degree. I think about one afternoon last summer, I was walking through the Harvard Yard in Boston. And I remember stopping just for a minute, and I looked around and thought, how did I get here? Because in that moment, I wasn't thinking about Harvard. I was thinking about that little girl whose desk was moved into the hallway, and the little girl whose report card always said talks instead of listens. And the funny thing was, I was listening. I was listening every time someone made me feel like I wasn't smart enough. I was listening every time I felt like I was too much. I was listening every time I wondered if they might be right. But somewhere deep down, I also believed I was meant to be a part of something bigger than myself. So years later, after barely making it through undergrad, I made the decision to go back to school and completely change careers. And I told myself that I was doing it for me, and I was. But if I'm being completely honest, part of me was doing it for that little girl too. I wanted her to know that she wasn't wrong about herself. I wanted her to know that she wasn't lazy and she wasn't broken and she wasn't less capable. She had a different brain. And as I became a teacher, I realized something else, that the kids sitting in my classroom, they're living the life that I lived. And I wanted them to have something that I didn't always have. Someone who understood them, someone who believed in them before they believed in themselves. And then I realized I wanted to understand ADHD even more deeply, not just as a teacher, but through the lens of neuroscience. And through what still seems like an unbelievable chain of events, one email led to an invitation to spend the summer studying at Harvard. One professor saw something in me before they knew my story, before they knew my grades from years ago, before they knew my struggles. All they saw was potential. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have to take care of anyone else. I got to spend an entire summer learning, asking questions and being curious, surrounded by some of the brightest minds in the world. And something happened there that I didn't expect. And it wasn't that I suddenly became smarter. I'd always been capable. I just finally believed it. And standing there, I realized that little girl had been enough all along. She didn't need to become someone else. She just needed someone to see her, including herself. And that's why this series exists, because I want every one of you to experience your own Magnificent Me moment. And it may not happen at Harvard. It may happen, watching your child succeed because of something that you taught them. It may happen finishing a degree, starting over, getting through something that you never thought that you would survive. Or simply looking in the mirror one day and realizing, maybe I've been enough all along. And that's what I want for you. Not perfection, not someone else's life. I want you to know what it feels like to become the version of yourself that you've always been capable of becoming. Because you're not just enough. You're capable of extraordinary things. So I'm not going to ask you to write your Magnificent Me moment tonight. Some of you might already know what yours is. Some of you might need time to think about it. And maybe you'll remember it in the drive, on your drive home or in the car. Maybe it'll come to you next week, or maybe you haven't had it yet. And I also want you to leave a few blank pages in this journal. And when that moment comes to you, write it down. Write what happened, write how you felt, write why it mattered, and most importantly, write what it taught you about yourself. Because when life gets hard, and again, it will, you can come back to that page and remember who you are at your very best. But here's the thing, Magnificent Me moments don't usually happen out of nowhere. They're built from hundreds of little moments. So on another page in your journal, I want you to start something called a rainbow list. Every day, or as often as you remember, write down one thing that went well. It does not have to be big. Maybe you remembered your medication. Maybe you advocated for yourself. Maybe you finally folded that laundry that's been sitting in the basket for 3 weeks. Maybe you played with your kids instead of folding the laundry. Maybe you finally made that phone call you've been putting off. Maybe you simply got out of bed on a really hard day. Those little moments may not feel magnificent at the time, but over weeks and months and years, they become the evidence of the life that you're building. And as you start making your rainbow list, I want you to practice one more thing. Do not put an asterisk next to your accomplishments. So many of us have spent years throwing dirt on our accomplishments. I graduated, but it took me longer than everyone else. We throw dirt on it, right? I asked for help, but anybody could have done that. We always have that but. We have to throw dirt on it. I was a good parent today, but I forgot that permission slip. We have this habit of taking something beautiful and then immediately talking ourselves out of it. Why is that? This journal is different. There is no asterisks, there are no footnotes, there are no buts. Do not throw dirt on your accomplishments, no matter how small they are. Just let the good thing be a good thing. I showed up. I kept going. I was brave. I graduated. I apologized. I rested. Period. That's it. And then one day you'll look back and realize that those little rainbow moments were quietly creating your next magnificent me moment. So as we get ready to wrap up tonight, I want you to think back to the beginning of our journey. We started with a backpack. It was overflowing with bills and appointments and laundry and work and family and responsibilities. And if you're anything like me, sometimes it feels like you're carrying all of this while trying to remember where you even put your keys. But here's the thing. I can't take anything out of your backpack. I wish I could. Life is still going to be busy. The laundry will still be there tomorrow. Your bills are still going to need to be paid. ADHD doesn't disappear. But hopefully, your backpack looks a little different now. Maybe you've added some tools. Maybe you've learned that sleep matters. Maybe movement is something that you want to try. Maybe you're going to pay attention to nutrition. Maybe you're finally going to understand why hormones affect your ADHD. Maybe you're considering medication, or you're realizing that your environment can do some of the remembering for you. And maybe you've learned that those executive functioning strategies that we've talked about previously for your kids can actually work for you too. And maybe the biggest tool you collected tonight was not a strategy at all. Maybe it was self-compassion. Because understanding your brain doesn't make the mountain disappear, but it does help you carry it differently. And sometimes that's enough to make tomorrow feel a little bit lighter. So when we had at the beginning of the night, when I asked you not to try to change everything, I meant it. If you leave here with a list of 20 things that you should do, chances are you're going to feel overwhelmed before you even get home. Instead, I want you to open your journal one last time. I want you to write down one small experiment. Not a goal, not a promise, an experiment. Maybe it's going to bed 30 minutes earlier. Maybe it's taking a walk after dinner. Maybe it's eating a little more protein in the morning. And maybe it's setting a reminder instead of trying to remember everything yourself. Maybe it's scheduling an appointment to talk to your doctor. Whatever it is, make it small enough that it is feasible. Because again, this isn't about perfection. This is about curiosity. And if it works, wonderful. If it doesn't, that's okay too. You're not failing. You're learning more about what your brain needs. And one small experiment can become one small habit. And one small habit can change a lot over time. So write down one thing that you're willing to try this week, not for the rest of your life, just this week. So as we finish tonight, I want to leave you with this. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't have to see the whole path. You just have to take the next step. There will still be days when the road feels steep. There will be days when your battery is low, and there will be moments when you forget or you get overwhelmed or you have to start again. It doesn't mean that you're failing. It means that you're human. You are not broken, and you are not lazy. You are not too much. You have a brain that works differently, and that's okay. And hopefully now you understand it a little bit better. So be curious, be patient with yourself, celebrate your progress no matter how small. Keep collecting tools, keep learning, and keep asking for help when you need it. And most importantly, keep walking. And before we finish tonight, I just want to say thank you. I want to thank every one of you who showed up, who came to every session, to those who brought a friend, who watched online, to those who asked questions and shared your stories and trusted me with your struggles and helped build this incredible community over the past few weeks. This series only exists because all of you took a chance on someone who has never taught neuroscience before, but who cared deeply about this community and believed that everyone deserves access to understanding. And I truly believe that knowledge changes lives. And when we understand the brain, we can stop asking what's wrong with me and start asking, what does my brain need? And again, that changes everything. And when I stood in Harvard last summer, I never imagined that 1 year later, I'd be standing here sharing everything I learned with all of you. But that's exactly why I went, not to keep all the knowledge to myself, but to bring it home to our community. Because every parent and every teacher and every adult with ADHD deserves to understand the brain that they're living with. So thank you for allowing me to be a small part of your journey. And thank you for becoming such an important part of mine. This series was not created for people who fit neatly inside of a metaphorical box. It was created for people who have always wondered why they never quite fit inside of it. Because maybe you were never meant to fit inside the box. Maybe you were simply wired for wonder. Thank you so much for being here.